Howdy, Immortalium here, and today I'm going to be reviewing Black Magic by Shirow Masamune. Now, if that name Shirow Masamune seems familiar to you, that is because he went on to create two very successful franchises, one being the Appleseed franchise, which in its own right is quite popular and successful, but on the other hand, the much more successful and popular Ghost in the Shell franchise. So as you might imagine, he has had quite the impact on both the manga and anime industries. And this manga is actually his first. It was originally a doujinshi that was released in 1983. And the question is it good? And that's what we're going to be discussing today. So let's get started. So what is the story of Black Magic? So Black Magic takes place on Venus, the planet Venus, a long time ago. And we learned that humans who are living on Venus developed this supercomputer called Nemesis. And Nemesis kind of takes over all government functions and essentially becomes a benevolent dictator. In order to carry out his will, he decides to create the role of executors, people who will carry out his will, which are bioroids, which are people who are grown up and developed specifically for that task. Eventually, Nemesis creates another supercomputer called Tantalos, and Tantalos eventually creates a robot terminal called Uranus. And eventually, Uranus develops a bioroid called Kronos. And Kronos takes over government functions. He becomes the first democratically elected leader on Venus. Eventually, Zeus is created, and Zeus defeats Kronos in an election. And Nemesis and Tantalos aren't particularly keen on Zeus and the direction that humanity is going. And so they create Typhon. And Typhon fights against Zeus, but is destroyed by Zeus. So Nemesis decides to recreate Typhon and to have her in hiding. And actually, as the story begins, we witness an attack from Zeus's agents against Typhon, and Typhon has to go on the run. And that's where the story begins. As you might have guessed from my summary of the story, there is a lot of information here. And you would think that a lot of information would be good, but it actually isn't. All that information that I provided to you about Tantalos, about Uranus, about Kronos and Zeus and Typhon, were all in the space of a single paragraph that had no images associated with it. And as you might imagine, it is actually quite difficult to follow that and to understand the world that they're in, which I think is a tremendous misfire from Shirow Masamune. I think he does a pretty poor job from that regard with building up the world and society of Venus. With regards to the story itself, you would think that given the length of this manga, it's less than 200 pages long, that there'd be a very tight focus on Typhon and her gang as they're against Zeus. And instead, we get this kind of funny alternating between Typhon and her gang and kind of standalone stories following other characters on Venus. And it's a very strange way to tell a story. Overall, with regards to the stories itself, I actually ended up enjoying the standalone stories more than the ongoing story. And to be honest, I think a lot of people would agree with that, given the fact that the OVA decided that rather than following the main story of this manga, they would take one of these standalone stories instead and follow that instead. So it becomes very difficult to develop any momentum for the main story of Typhon. And actually, a lot of her motivations and the characters around her remain very undeveloped. Because of that, I found the main story itself very uninteresting. All of this eventually culminates in an ending, which to me felt very sudden and jarring, almost as if Shirow Masamune had lost interest in writing this manga. And overall, the question of did I enjoy this manga actually becomes a little difficult. Because as I said before, I actually did enjoy some of the standalone stories in this manga. I thought they were pretty well told. When it comes to the main meat of the story, Typhon versus Zeus's agents, I just feel like the story is highly underdeveloped, and because of that it becomes very uninteresting and then kind of ends very lacklusterly. So my overall thoughts on the story is that it's not particularly good. With regards to the artwork, now the artwork here is very interesting. As you might imagine, this is less detailed than many of Shirow Masamune's later artwork. However, I have to confess something and actually admit that I actually like this artwork more than some of his later artwork. with his later artwork, the amount of detail that would quite often lead to very crowded panels, making it difficult to follow what's going on, leading you to be distracted by what's going on in the background. In contrast, in Black Magic, the character designs are very Shirow Masamune, but the lack of detail actually helps serve the story and actually helps us to focus a bit more on the characters as undeveloped as they are. And so overall, I have to say that the artwork itself is pretty good. I actually quite like the artwork. And I kind of wish that he had developed his artwork more in this style, in contrast to his later works where he would just stuff in so much detail that it became difficult to follow. With regards to how this volume was released, if we take a look at my trusty Yotsuba, you will see that it is a little bigger than your standard tankobon, which is great, lets the great artwork stand out. And this was released by Dark Horse, and Dark Horse decided to give it some very nice paper quality, and to also include a variety of information that Shirow Masamune gives about the world and the story and the technology in the back, which is quite a nice addition. Now, admittedly, by the time I reached that, I felt quite disappointed at the ending and unattached to the characters, and so as you might imagine, it was quite laborious for me to read through all of this information. But nonetheless, it was decent, and I do think that it was a good addition by Dark Horse. So overall, I think Dark Horse did quite a good job releasing this. So, with regards to my overall thoughts on the manga, well, the story itself is very problematic. I like the standalone stories, but the main story itself I'm not a fan of. I do enjoy the artwork, and I think Dark Horse did a very good job releasing this. But, admittedly, I don't think that this manga is worth reading, at least unless you're a Shirow Masamune fan, in which case you will be very interested in this manga as you will be able to see where he started out, what types of storytelling he was doing, how his artwork developed. For those people, there's a lot here. But for other people, those who are fans of sci-fi, those who are fans of manga in general, I just don't think that there's enough substance in this manga. And so I have to give this a kind of a skip it rating. I just don't think it's good enough to be worth your time or money. So that was my review of Black Magic. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment, rate, subscribe, and bye-bye.